Yes, it's wonderful to be back here with you all, just to worship the Lord this morning. And please take your Bible and turn to the book of Genesis, chapter 41. Genesis chapter 41. We're going to find ourselves going back in time this morning into the land of Egypt. So try imagine Egypt with me for a moment. And we're just going to begin our text by reading verse 1. We're going to look at this morning verses 1 to verse 49. So you'll see that's quite a lot of text. But let's just begin by reading verse 1. Now it happened at the end of 2 full years. All right, now those are some ominous words. Huh? All right, what happened at the end of 2 full years? What happened 2 years before that? Anyways, we'll come back to that later on in the story. But what we read next is that Pharaoh has a cow dream. As I was driving here this morning, we passed a bunch of cows. And I was asking my kids what they knew about this particular story of this dream. But it's a very significant thing that happens. All right, and you need to realize, by the way, as we read this cow dream, what dreams meant to the Egyptians. The Egyptians had a whole study and practice of dreams, and they viewed dreams as the gods speaking to them, and so they viewed it as revelation. They took it very, very, very seriously, and there were a whole people that their whole business, their whole job was to interpret the dreams of others. All right, so Pharaoh, that's actually a title, by the way. That's the title of the king of the land of Egypt, and he has these cow dreams, all right? And let's read what it says. So Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. Let's carry on, verses 2 to 4. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. All right, so that's his cow dream. Now, you need to realize this cow in Egypt was actually an emblem of the goddess of fertility called Isis. I'm sure you've heard the name Isis before, or a very significant god in the land of Egypt, and the cow represented that goddess. So it would have had a lot of significance to Pharaoh having this dream about these cows. You know, the first group of 7 was sleek. That means their fur was smooth and glossy. They were very healthy looking cows, all right? Very healthy looking cows. And then the 7 gaunt cows came up, very thin, extremely hungry. Their ribs would have been sticking out. All right. Basically, they were haggard. They were haggard and hungry. And what did these haggard and hungry cows do? Well, they ate the big fat cows, but there was no change in these cows. And then Pharaoh wakes up and he's wondering to himself, what's going on? Well, we read next that soon after this, Pharaoh has a grain dream in verses 5 to 7. So let's read that. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then, behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. All right, so this is his second dream, and this time he dreams about grain. And you need to realize that this grain that we read about in the text is a reference to wheat. All right, now there's a lot of discussion about wheat today in the world. The United Nations this week was involved in signing deals, contracts with Russia and Ukraine, and Russia is saying they're going to give permission to Ukraine to export their wheat, and people are talking about a coming wheat crisis around the world, saying it's going to affect everyone, including us here in South Africa. There's a lot of discussion about wheat. Wheat is very necessary. It was part of their staple diet. And this dream is all about wheat and grain. All right? And then you notice there are these very healthy looking ears of wheat. All right? And then there's 7 very unhealthy ones that we are told are scorched by the east wind. All right. So this east wind is a very strong wind that would blow through the desert. So as the wind would blow, the temperature would rise a lot as it's traveling over the hot desert land. And when that wind then hit the crops, it would basically decimate the crops. It actually has a specific name. In Palestine, they call it the Sirocco Wind. And in Egypt, they call it the Kamsin wind. And that's what they're talking about here. This wind that comes, destroys these crops. And so you have these 7 ears that are completely thin and scorched. And what do? They eat up the 7 healthy ears of corn. All right, so you can see it's the same kind of dream that Pharaoh has had twice. But what does he do in response? So this is what we read in verse 8. Basically, Pharaoh seeks an interpretation for his dreams. All right, let's read verse 8. Now in the morning, his spirit was troubled. So he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. All right. So Pharaoh is perturbed. He believes that the gods are speaking to him. He wants to know what the message is. So he calls the dream experts. Now, this was their job. Their job was to find out what these dreams meant. And they had no idea. All right. Who are these magicians? Well, these magicians are, to be frank with you, occultists. All right, they engage in the realm of the demonic. They are experts basically in the dark arts of magic. And what they would do is essentially commune with demons. And they were energized by demons, all right? And this kind of stuff goes on a lot today, all right? We have sangomas, witchcraft, all of that kind of stuff. Ancestors, whatever name you call it, it's basically the same thing, all right? They would engage with evil spirits, and they would get information from evil spirits that the Bible calls demons. But in this case, the dreams weren't inspired by demons in any way. The demons had nothing to do with it. The holy God had given these dreams to Pharaoh, and therefore they were powerless to actually give any kind of accurate interpretation at all to Pharaoh. All right, now something very interesting happens in the story at this juncture. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer speaks up. All right, this man is one of Pharaoh's confidants. He was the man that would pull Pharaoh his wine, his drink, whatever it is. He would test it for him. So he was a highly trusted individual. If he wanted to, he would be one of the prime guys who could possibly kill Pharaoh through poisoning. So he had to be a very trusted person. He always was by the side of Pharaoh. And then he suddenly remembers an experience he had. And so he tells Pharaoh about this. Let's read about that in verses 9 to 13. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. And here he's talking about jail. He was sent to jail, all right? Him and the chief baker. We had a dream on the same night. He and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. What he's saying is, when he was in jail, he had a dream, and the baker also had a dream. They both had a dream on the same night. Like I told you, these Egyptians, they took their dreams very, very, very seriously, right? And they were freaking out because they didn't know what their dreams meant. But then we read in verse 12, now a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him. And he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. So what he's saying is there was this Hebrew guy, and he was actually in charge of us in the jail. And when he saw that we were messed up, he asked us, what's wrong with you guys? And we told him, listen, we've had dreams, but we don't know what they mean. And he said to us, don't worry, I know the God who can interpret dreams. Tell me your dream. And so they told this young man their dream. And then he, through the power of God, interpreted the dream. And then look at what happens in verse 13. And just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. So if you remember the baker's dream, the prediction was he was going to hang, Pharaoh was going to hang him in 3 days' time. And then the chief cupbearer's dream was that Pharaoh was going to restore him in 3 days' time. And that is exactly what had happened. Now that had happened, ladies and gentlemen, under Joseph's prison ministry. All right? When Joseph was in jail, and he was in jail at this time, he had this ministry, and that is what we read about in verse 1. Go back to verse 1. You see there it says, now it happened at the end of 2 full years. What exactly had happened at the end of 2 full years? Well, that incident where Joseph had interpreted the dreams for the baker and the butler. And then we read in verse 23, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So the chief cupbearer went back to do his duty in Pharaoh's court, but he had forgotten what Joseph had done to him. All right, so I just want to read to you a couple of verses about this ministry. Look back at chapter 40, verse 3. Okay? So when these 2 gentlemen were cast into jail, they were specifically, Joseph was specifically instructed to watch over them in verse 3. All right, so he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, in the jail, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. And verse 4, the captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. It's an amazing thing, this. Joseph was thrown into jail, right? And he was given the responsibility of looking after these, you could call them celebrity prisoners, right? These were 2 celebrity prisoners, and that's exactly what he did, is he looked after these gentlemen. And then you see verse 8, then he said to them, we have had a dream, and there's no one to interpret it. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please. All right? So after seeing that they were vexed, he says, listen, I know God. Tell me your dream, and maybe God will reveal it to you. So that's exactly what they do. And then we read down in verses 12 to 13, then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now he's talking here about the cupbearer. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand according to your former custom when you were his cupbearer. All right? And that's exactly what did happen. But I want you to see something here. This is very, very important. Okay? Joseph was serving his God. And he had experienced some tremendous evil in his life, all right? And he tells this cupbearer about the evil that he had experienced, because Joseph was a victim, all right? He was a victim of incredible injustice. And this is what he tells him in the next 2 verses. Look at verse 14. He gives an appeal to this man. He says, only keep me in mind when it goes well with you. And please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. What is he saying? He's saying, listen, I've ministered to you. I've given you God's revelation about what your dream means. And in 3 days' time, you're not going to be here anymore. You're not going to be in jail anymore. You're going to be back with Pharaoh. So please, when you have the king's ear, put in a good word for me so that I can get taken out of jail. Now, why does he say that, friends? Have a look at the following verse. All right? For I was in fact, this is verse 15, for I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. What he's saying is he was kidnapped. And if you go back in the story, you'll see that his brothers were the ones that kidnapped him. And they sold him as a slave. They didn't like Joseph because God had given revelation to Joseph in a dream. And he had told everyone this dream. And it implied that everyone in the family would bow down to Joseph. So they didn't like Joseph. They were jealous of Joseph. Joseph was the favorite son. All right? And they despised him. And they saw this opportunity they actually wanted to kill him. And then through God's providence, an opportunity came to sell him as a slave, and that's what they did. Now imagine that. Imagine you were taken by your brothers and sold as a slave. And those slave traders, those Ishmaelites, took him down to Egypt, and they sold him to a man called Potiphar, an incredibly powerful man. This man was in charge of basically the private security guard of Pharaoh himself. And so he became a slave. Can you imagine how that would completely change your life? That's the first terrible injustice he mentions. But that's not all, friends. It carries on, and he mentions a second one in verse 15. And even here, I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. The dungeon is a graphic representation of jail. So what Joseph is telling this man, he's saying, listen, when I was a slave, all right, that's one bad thing in and of itself. But you know what? I was unjustly accused by Potiphar's wife. And as a result of that, I was made a prisoner. Now, what's fascinating, if you go back and you look at that story, we don't have time to do it today. Think about it. Joseph wasn't appealing to Potiphar's wife initially, even though the text says that he was a very handsome Hebrew man. All right, he was very handsome, but she wasn't attracted to him. But as time went on, he became esteemed by Potiphar because he was so productive in the house. And this was all by God's grace, by the way. And then as a result, Potiphar raised him to a position of preeminence in his house. He was the chief slave, the chief manager, so to speak, of Potiphar's house. And Potiphar gave him all of this. And then as he rose with that prestige, he became more attractive to the eyes of Potiphar's wife, and then she tried to seduce him. Not once, friend, not twice, but it says day after day after day. Now, what was Joseph's response? He says, how can I commit such a great evil? Now, think about this. This is a man of God. This is a man who has been separated from his family. There is no accountability. Forget about going on a business trip. He is living in another land. No one he knows that is a follower of Yahweh will ever be in touch with him ever again. He can commit any sin he wants. Who's going to care? And it would be to his advantage to follow through with the sexual sin, right? But he didn't live his life in the eyes of men. He lived his life before God because he had faith in Yahweh and he knew full well the law of God. It would be completely wrong to violate his master's wife, even though she was the one inviting him to do so. And so he said, under no circumstances. And then you know the story. The one day she basically entraps him and he says no and he runs away and she grabs his coat. And then she comes up with a false accusation of rape. And she says, this man tried to rape me. And as a result of that false accusation, a pure man who wants to live for the glory of God and honor his master's wife is then accused of rape and then thrown into jail for that. Now, how would you respond, friend? Think of what's going on in your life right now. What trial are you going through? How does that compare to being kidnapped, sold as a slave, and imprisoned for pursuing holiness and being falsely accused? That's this man. And what does he do in the midst of it? It's actually an incredible testimony of his faith. He lives for the glory of God. And he is responsible and he is productive to live for the glory of God. He understands that God is in control of his circumstances. He understands that God is working out his purposes on earth. He doesn't know the story. He doesn't know how it's going to end. He doesn't know exactly how God's going to get glory. He doesn't know all those details. All he knows is he must trust God. And he must follow God. And he must live out his faith before God. And that's what he does. And what's amazing is he gets esteemed in jail again, a second time. it's very evident through his faith in Yahweh that he is productive by the grace of God, and the person in charge of the jail then makes him in charge of all the prisoners, it says. Can you imagine that? This man, a foreigner, is now in charge of all of the prisoners. And then these two high-profile prisoners come into the jail, and the prison warden says, listen, Joseph, I'm putting you specifically in charge of these two gentlemen. You look after them, and that's what he does. And as part of his prison ministry, that's why I call it his prison ministry, he ministers to them. He sees that they're vexed. He asks them, what's the story? They say, we've had a dream. He says, well, God interprets dreams. He interprets the dreams for them, obviously through God's supernatural intervention and assistance there. And the dream comes true. And then this guy forgets. Now imagine that was you. Imagine you have this, as we were driving here this morning, we saw this amazing rainbow. Did you guys see the rainbow today? All right. So imagine living in a dungeon, in a darkness, in a prison, then all of a sudden there's a glimmer of hope. There's a little bit of light. In God's providence, I've just spoken to a man who in 3 days will have the king's ear. Please, please, be kind to me, sir. Remember me before the king. And you wait 3 days, and you're sitting there and you wait, and you don't share anything. A week later, you don't share anything. A month later, you don't share anything. A year later, you don't share anything. 2 years. 2 years. Now, I don't know what's going on in your life, but some trials are long trials, aren't they? I mean, some trials are actually lifelong trials. Maybe there's a physical situation you're going through, or all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's just incredible to see. We can plan our lives, can't we? We can have our calendars and plan, we're going to do this and we do that. But you know what? God has His calendar, friend, that supersedes our calendar. And His plan for our life supersedes our plans for our life. Now, there's nothing wrong about planning, but there's a recognition and an acknowledgement that God is actually ultimately in control of all of this. And what we see here, think about this. Joseph wakes up in the morning as a former slave who is now imprisoned, and as far as he can know, he's been forgotten forever by this cupbearer. He wakes up in the morning as a prisoner. And unbeknownst to him, that cupbearer 2 years later has remembered him and is just busy telling Pharaoh about what he did 2 years before. And then look at what happens. Verse 14, look at what happens. Joseph is brought to Pharaoh. All right? So let's go back to chapter 41, verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph. And they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. Now, if you know anything about your Bible and the Hebrews and the Jews and the Israelites and all that stuff, and you've watched the Jesus film, all right, those guys, they love their beards. All right? Some of you have some great beards this morning, all right? Okay, these were bearded, very proud of their beards. But in Egypt, it wasn't like that. A beard was a no-no, all right? So in Egypt, it was the clean-shaven look. That was the etiquette. And they take this man, can you imagine? The king of Egypt now, bring that guy out of jail now. He's a foreigner, he's an alien in our land, he's a Hebrew, bring him out, but he has to be presented correctly. So he quickly has a shave, they shave him, they give him new clothes, and all of a sudden now we see a transition. We see a transition, ladies and gentlemen, from a prison ministry to a palace ministry. And that's the title of the message this morning. The title of the message this morning is Palace Ministry. And what is remarkable here, for the rest of the story, we now see him administering his same faith of Yahweh, all right, serving his same God. In the morning, he was serving his God in jail. Later that day, he's serving God in the palace. The only difference is the location. And so consider yourself for a moment. If you say, well, what is the implication for me here? God is in control of where you are, isn't He? Think of the job you have, maybe the place where you live, maybe the neighbors you have, maybe the family you're in. All of those scenarios, none of that's by mistake. It's not completely random or by chance. This is God working. And then let's consider how He responds to this. All right? So he's brought to the king, and he stands before this man, the most powerful man in the land. And then Pharaoh explains his predicament to Joseph. We read this in verse 15. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. That's very straightforward, isn't it? Pharaoh is saying, listen, it's been told to me that you have a skill, and I need that skill. I need that skill now because I've had a dream and I want to know what it means. Now, Joseph's response here is illuminating because if you think about it, this is an opportunity for Joseph to trumpet his skill, so to speak, right? To boast about his ability to interpret a dream. And it's absolutely amazing what he says. He doesn't talk about himself. He talks about God. And you see, this is a man who walked by faith. What we see here is a man who is truly humble. A man who understands that his ability to be productive in Potiphar's house, his ability to oversee these criminals, whatever they were, murderers, rapists, whoever they were. You remember, he went to jail as a so-called rapist, the worst of the worst. He had the ability to lead these people in jail. All of that, he realized that that ability came from God. And so look at what he says to Pharaoh in verse 16. He says, Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. It's not in me. He's saying, no, let me correct you there. You've heard that I have a skill, that I have this unique ability. He's like, no, it's actually not about me. It's actually about God. I just happen to know the God who gives the interpretation. That's all. Now consider this for a moment. Pharaoh was a polytheist. He believed in many gods. There were all kinds of gods. They practiced idolatry. There was all kinds of paganism practice that they engaged in Egypt. And here Joseph is using this particular word, Elohim. It's the word for God, all right? And the word Elohim, it's used throughout Genesis 1, and it speaks of God as the creator. So it speaks of His power, and it speaks of His sovereignty, that God is in control of all things. And so what he's saying is, you know what? God will give you the interpretation because Joseph knew that God was the one that had given him the dream. You see, the dream is direct revelation from God. That's why the magicians couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't interpret the dream for him. But I want you to understand something. As you study the life of Joseph in Egypt, everyone is aware that what he did was because of God's grace. Potiphar recognized it, the prison warden recognized it, and now Pharaoh will recognize it as well because he testified that what he did was from God. And it reminds me of the psalmist in Psalm 119, verse 46. All right, so let me read this to you. Psalm 119, verse 46. It says, I will also speak of your testimonies before kings and shall not be ashamed. I will also speak of your testimonies before kings and shall not be ashamed. If I had to go ask your colleagues at work, do you know so-and-so? Are they a follower of Jesus? What would they say? Do they know that you're a follower of Jesus? Is it evident in what you say? Are you ashamed of the law of God? Are you ashamed of what God says about things? You see, we should never be ashamed of God, right? I mean, think of what Joseph does. He takes every opportunity to talk about God and to communicate that he's a follower of God, and that's what he does, and it's very powerful. The Lord uses it in an amazing way. All right. Now, let's have a look at what happens next. In response to Joseph's claim, Pharaoh recounts his dreams to him. Now, let's read this in verses 17 to 24. There's a bit of repetition because you've obviously heard the dreams already, but there's some added information that is given now in the text. So let's read verses 17 to 24. So Pharaoh spoke to Joseph. In my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, and behold, 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Lo, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such as I had never seen for ugliness in all the land of Egypt. These are the ugliest cows that Pharaoh had ever seen. And the lean and ugly cows ate up the first 7 cows. Yet, when they had devoured them, it could not be detected that they had devoured them, for they were just as ugly as before. Then I awoke. I saw also in my dream, and behold, 7 ears, full and good, came up on a single stalk. And lo, 7 ears, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed the 7 good ears. Then I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. All right. Now, with God's assistance, Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams with God's assistance. And we read this in verses 25 to 32. Now Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. In other words, they're both referring to a 7-year period. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 thin years scorched by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt. And after them, 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. So the abundance will be unknown in the land because of the subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God. And God will quickly bring it about. It's pretty clear, right? You've had 2 dreams, it's 2 images, but they're both representing the same thing. There's going to be a 7-year period where there's going to be plenty, lots of crops, very productive. Everything will be good and healthy. All the animals will be nice and fat and juicy. We're going to have lots of fantastic rice. But then there's going to be 7 years of famine. Famine you've never seen before in your life, Pharaoh. It's going to be so bad that we will completely forget about all those 7 years of plenty. And so basically that's what he's explaining to him here. All right? And it's very clear that God is the one who has shown this to Pharaoh through direct revelation in a dream. And he's telling him what he is about to do. Okay, God is determinate, and it will happen quickly in verse 32. In other words, there isn't time to mess around. The 7 years of plenty is about to begin. It's on our doorstep. Okay. Now, based on this imminent threat, Joseph advises Pharaoh. Now, think about it. Think what he's doing here. He's standing, he's a prisoner, right? Pharaoh could just click his fingers and have Joseph executed on the spot. And he's told him what the dreams mean, but he doesn't leave him there. He now goes on to give him advice. This is wisdom from the Lord. And let's read what he says there, verse 33 to 37. Now let Pharaoh look for a man, discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact a fifth of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Then let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up the grain for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority, and let them guard it. Let the food become as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine. Now the proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. This is wise counsel, isn't it? All right, there's a coming catastrophe. You've got to prepare for it. And here's some basic advice on how you can go about preparing for it. Basically, you need an overseer. You need a manager who's going to manage all of this. Someone in charge of all of Egypt, of this whole project. It's a massive project. You're going to have to appoint a number of overseers, which will obviously be in charge of local areas. And so all around the land of Egypt, you'll have these collection points. People will have to give, what does it say there? A fifth. That's 20%. So during the 7 years of plenty, this wise and discerning leader will have to win the confidence of the people, because he's going to be asking them for 20% of their produce, and 20% will be stored in these local storehouses. Can you imagine that? So so it needs to be someone like that. And then once the famine hits, you guys are sorted. Okay? So that's his advice to Pharaoh. Makes a lot of common sense, doesn't it? Well, Pharaoh listens to Joseph's advice, and in response, he promotes Joseph. He promotes Joseph. You guys know the story. Do you think Joseph saw that coming? All right. Let's just read it. Let's read Pharaoh's response. Now remember, this is a pagan. This is an idol worshiper. He has just heard about this Hebrew's God, all right? And he's just believed that the Hebrew's God has given him revelation and has interpreted that revelation through this young Hebrew man. And he decides to elevate this foreigner. And let's read what he says in verse 38 to 44. Then Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is a divine spirit?" Now that literally means the Spirit of God. Now think about that for a second, all right? Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? He's just heard about the Creator, the Sovereign One, who is providentially in control of all things in the universe. And he says, can we find a man who has the Spirit of God? And he knows there is no one else that he knows in the world that has the Spirit of God. The only person he knows in the world that has the Spirit of God is this follower of Yahweh, this young Hebrew man called Joseph. Okay? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this. Now notice here, the testimony of Joseph is now coming through to fruition, right? He understands it's not Joseph per se who has the skill, but it's God, the God of Joseph, who's working through the man. And he's recognizing that. And he's saying, since this God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. He's recognizing the wisdom and discernment you possess is coming from your God. And so this is his next point. You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you. Do you not understand what he's saying? You can walk down to Spa, and people are going to do homage to you. They will kiss your hand. They will bow before you. You can go surf super tubes and everyone will part way and give you priority. That's basically what he's saying. If you surf, you understand what I'm saying. Wherever you go, everyone will pay homage to you. You go to the four-way stop street, they will all let you go. Because you will be the most powerful person in this land, apart from, obviously, Pharaoh the king. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put the gold necklace around his neck. Now consider, he had been prepared to be in the presence of Pharaoh, so he was already dressed in fine clothing. Now he's given clothing that is distinctive of absolute royalty and power. And before that, this is now his third change of clothes in one day. Before that, he was in prisoner's clothes. His orange jumpsuit, or whatever they wore back then. All right? And then he gives him his signet ring. So the signet ring is obviously, it was used as a seal on all official documents in Egypt. Okay, so it was the equivalent of Pharaoh's signature. In other words, Joseph could make any official decision he wanted. There was no Congress. There was no parliament. He didn't have to go and debate the issue or vote on anything. He could decide anything he wanted to, get the signet ring, stamp it on the seal, and send it throughout the land. That's now law. That was the power this man had. It's actually quite incredible just to think about this for a little bit, right? So he had the signet ring. And then verse 43, we just carry on. He had him ride in his second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, bow the knee. So he would ride throughout the capital city, and then people were saying, bow the knee, and everyone would bow the knee, and he set him over the land of Egypt. Moreover, verse 44, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. He's saying that's how much power you have. You can control the very lives of any citizen you desire. They can't even raise their hand or lift their foot without your permission. Obviously an idiom just of the absolute authority this man had. It really is incredible. Now I want you to think for a moment, friend. That kind of power could go to the head of any person, right? And a person with that power could very easily become a tyrant and use that power for selfish gain. Would you want our present government of this country to prepare for a 7-year famine? How much grain do you think will be there in 7 years' time? All right? Now think about this man's character. This is a man of God who has a track record, a proven track record of integrity and being highly productive all due to the grace of God. And you have to see this. You have to see this in the text. Look at chapter 39, all right? Verses 2 and 3. It says there, Yahweh was with Joseph. So he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptians, talking about Pharaoh, Potiphar. Now his master saw that Yahweh was with him. And how Yahweh caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. Potiphar would come home from his day of work and he would see all that was done in that day by his slaves. And what he noticed was there was this one slave called Joseph the Hebrew, and it was God, his God, who was working in his life. And what's fascinating here, you will notice there is a different word for God that is used. When Joseph is evangelizing, when he is witnessing to pagans, he uses the word Elohim, he uses the word God, referring to the Creator, the Sovereign One. But when the writer of Genesis, who is Moses, by the way, inspired by the Holy Spirit, is referring to God's relationship with Joseph, it uses his covenant name, the very name of God. You know that God is a name. It is Yahweh. And there's this level of intimacy we see that as a slave, God has not forgotten this man. In fact, he's a slave by God's design. And God hasn't left him for a second. In fact, God is with this man. And you, friend, you need to consider what's going on in your life and realize today that if you're a follower of Jesus, that God is with you. Yahweh is with you in that trial. As I speak to you now, I have super glue in my eye. In the last 3 months, I've had 4 surgeries on my eye. A few weeks ago, I was rushed up to Johannesburg for an emergency surgery. I was in so much pain, I was vomiting from the pain, and the only way the doctor could relieve the pain was to stick a needle in my eye. I was going to him 3 times a day. People were rushing me to the doctor. I was vomiting literally in buckets in the car. And whatever your situation is, you just have to step back and remind yourself, God is with you and He is doing something, isn't He? He is. And it's remarkable to see what He was doing. And He was very productive. And what's fascinating is when you go through the valley of the shadow of death, the temptation is to become bitter. The temptation is to wallow in self-pity. Maybe accuse God and say, why me? That's the one path you can go down. The other path is to say, Lord, I don't know why, but what I know is you are with me and you've given me this responsibility and I'm going to be productive and I'm going to serve you and I'm going to fulfill my responsibility. And that's what this man did. He fulfilled his responsibility and he was esteemed. And then obviously Potiphar's wife accused him of rape and then he was sent to jail. And then now go down to verse 21. When he's in jail, look at what we read in verse 21, chapter 39. But Yahweh was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. And you say, but that doesn't make sense. He's in jail, falsely accused for rape. And here we've been told that Yahweh is still with him. And not only that, but is extending kindness to him. How was Yahweh kind to this man? Listen to what it says. And gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. This is a God-given favor. The man in charge of the jail esteems Joseph because God is working through Joseph supernaturally. I believe this is divine grace working in his life. He's not wallowing in self-pity in the corner of the jail cell, friend. He's productive for the Lord wherever he is, no matter how he's constrained. And you need to consider this morning your lot in life. Maybe you're in some old age home, or maybe you're in some dead-end job, or maybe, I don't know what your story is, but God hasn't called you home. And that means there's something he wants you to do for him now. It may just be prayer. I don't know what it is. I don't know your story. I know my story. I don't know your story, friend. But God's not done with you. And Joseph knew that. And then look at verse 23. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because Yahweh was with him. And whatever he did, Yahweh made it to prosper. And when your friends and colleagues and neighbors see you doing things that to them is incomprehensible, and they know that you are able to do it because it is God's grace that is enabling you to do it, it does something to them. It's a powerful testimony of the grace of God in your life, friend. Now let's go back to chapter 41. Following his promotion, Pharaoh gives Joseph a wife. All right? He may have given up on ever getting married by this stage of his life. I don't know. We read this in verse 45. It's an interesting comment, and we could probably spend a bit of time here, but just let's read the text. Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphanath-Paneah. All right, that's obviously an Egyptian name. We're not 100% sure what it means. One guess is that it could mean God speaks, he lives. All right? The point is they had to give him an Egyptian name. They can't call him by his Hebrew name, so they gave him an Egyptian name. And then this, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife. So Pharaoh gives Joseph a wife, all right? Her name is Asenath, and she was the daughter of a priest, the priest of On. Now, On is quite a famous place in Egypt. Another name for it is Heliopolis, which was the cultic center of the sun god Ra. All right, you may have heard of the sun god Ra. All right, so imagine your father-in-law. He's like the main priest of the sun god Ra. Now, it's just an interesting thing to postulate. We're not given a whole lot of revelation about it. But here is a follower of Yahweh, undisputable, man of God, credible faith in his Lord, now marrying a pagan woman. But I tell you what, it seems that to me that Joseph, two things, probably would have embraced this as the sovereign plan of God, and no doubt would have started witnessing to her straight away. And more than likely, it seems she also became a follower of Yahweh, because you will see later on in the text, we won't go into it today, but if you carry on reading in Genesis, the names he gives his children, and then in the Providence of God, the history of what takes place, how those children are then incorporated into the tribes of Israel, and the names become very prominent in later biblical history and all of that. So this man is now a married man. So what a day. You wake up a prisoner, you get given a razor, new set of clothes, you get given a new set of clothes, made the most powerful man in Egypt, apart from Pharaoh, you get given a wife. All right, he struck gold, huh? And that's all God's providence, isn't it? He had no idea what was going to happen when he woke up that morning. Well, Joseph embraces his providentially appointed new task. Okay, and then he oversees the storing of food, and this is where we end our text this morning. So we see that at the end of verse 45, Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt, and then we read down to verse 49. Now Joseph was 30 years old, and that's very significant. We'll come back to that. When he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. What I want you to see here, friends, is that he embraced his new area of responsibility. That's all he did. So he never changed what just his area of responsibility changed. He fulfilled it again by the grace of God. That's all he did. Verse 47, during the 7 years of plenty, the land brought forth abundantly. So he gathered all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt and placed the food in the cities. He placed in every city the food from its own surrounding fields. Thus Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. All right. So he was incredibly effective at his job. So successful. They had far more than what they could even measure. Now in closing, let's just go back to this time reference because it is significant. All right, Moses gives us a time reference of how old he was when he stood before Pharaoh. We read there, verse 46, he was 30 years old. Now just turn back in your Bibles to chapter 37, verse 2, because this is the previous time reference given to us of Joseph. And there it says, these are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years of age when he was pasturing the flock with his brothers, while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. So at 17 years of old, we see that Joseph is a little bit of an arrogant guy, a little bit, and then he has these dreams and he tells them to his brothers. They get very upset with him, and it's probably very soon after that he is kidnapped and sent as a slave, all right? So let's say 17, 18, he's sent as a slave, and now we're looking at 12, 13 years later, he's standing before Pharaoh. So how long is his trial? It's over a decade. Over a decade. Is God done with the man? Is there no use for this man anymore? No, of course not. God's never done with his people, is he? He's never done with them. And it's just such a fascinating thing to think about and just to consider in your own life as well. Please turn to Psalm 105. Psalm 105, we have the psalmist reflecting on the life of Joseph. And there is a very brief summary given of Joseph's life in verses 17 to 22. And let me read this to you, all right? Psalm 105, 17, he sent a man before them. This is talking about God. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They afflicted his feet with fetters. He himself was laid in irons. That's talking about his imprisonment. You have his slavery. Then you have his imprisonment. Who sent him there? Who sent him there? God sent him there. And then verse 18, until the time that his word came to pass, the word of Yahweh tested him. Something was going on in those dark valleys, friends. It was a test. Where's your heart, Joseph? Are you going to give up? Are you going to endure, Joseph? You're being refined, Joseph. The heat is cranking up, Joseph. Are you going to apostatize? Are you going to put on Facebook that God is a loser? Or are you going to keep the faith, Joseph? You see, God is doing something. Joseph didn't know what he was doing, but God was testing him. God was testing him. And let's carry on reading. The king sent and released him, the ruler of peoples, and set him free. He made him lord of his house and ruler over his possessions. to imprison his princes at will, that he might teach his elders wisdom. And then, friends, what follows is the providence of God. Now, I want you to consider this for a moment. What God was doing was preparing the way to preserve his called out people, Israel, through whom eventually, centuries later, the Messiah, the Son of God, would be born. And so if you step back now from this narrative this morning and just reflect on the providence of God in your own personal life, and then let's think of the big picture of the gospel and what God is doing worldwide through the message of Jesus. And let's think about Joseph's life for a second. God was supernaturally orchestrating the details of his life to ensure that the nation of Israel would stay intact, so that one day in Bethlehem a baby would be born who would be the Son of God. And now, centuries later, he is working, that same God who is in control of all the details of the universe is working in your life in unique ways, so that you can be a testimony of that Messiah who died on that cross 2,000 years ago. And he will bring glory to his name in manners and ways that are beyond our comprehension. You know, I think of Abraham, 75 years old. At 75 years old, he was a pagan, an unbeliever in God. And God called him and said, pack your stuff and cross the desert. 75-year-old man. And what about Moses? He had been a murderer, friends. He had murdered a man in cold blood, fled for his life. Living a humble life in the desert there. At 80 years of age, he sees a bush on fire. It's burning, but it's not dying. And God speaks to him and commissions him, go back to that land where you murdered a man, and you bring my people out of slavery. Friend, your life is not done. Your life is not done until God calls you home. This is the amazing God we serve. He is doing incredible things through you that you have no idea of. You just have to have faith in him, trust in him. Never give up your faith in the Lord, and just be bold. Tell people about your Lord. Tell them that it's his grace that's keeping you through. Let me read this poem to you in closing. This is the last thing. I refuse to be discouraged, to be sad, or to cry. I refuse to be downhearted, and here's the reason why. I have a God who's mighty, who's sovereign and supreme. I have a God who loves me, and I am on his team. He is all wise and powerful. Jesus is his name. Though everything is changeable, my God remains the same. My God knows all that's happening, beginning to the end. His presence is my comfort. He is my closest friend. When sickness comes to weaken me, to bring my head down low, I call upon my mighty God. Into his arms I go. When circumstances threaten to rob me of my peace, he draws me close unto his breast, where all my strivings cease. And when my heart melts within me and weakness takes control, he gathers me into his arms and soothes my heart and soul. The great I am is with me. My life is in His hand. The Son of God is my hope. It's in His strength I stand. I refuse to be defeated. My eyes are on my God. He's promised to be with me as through this life I trod. I'm looking past my circumstances to heaven's throne above. My prayers have reached the heart of God. I'm resting in His love. I give God thanks in everything. My eyes are on His face. The battle's His. The victory's mine. He'll help me win the race. Let's pray. Lord, what do we say to this amazing story of your grace in this man's life? And we understand, Lord, that you are behind the things that happen in our lives. Many times we don't understand, and we often think that if we did understand, or if we did know all the facts, how the story ended, it would be easier to us. But where would be the faith in that? And help us to see you, Lord, in all of our trials in life, not just so that we can endure it, but so that you can be glorified, because that's actually what it's all about. And Lord, help us to remember that whatever we go through in this lifetime is just simply the twinkling of an eye, Lord. When it's been 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years, or however long it is in eternity, and we're with you in perfect bliss, and there's no sin, there's no anguish, there's no tears in heaven, we'll reflect back on our twinkling of an eye moment that we lived on this planet. And this is the time we have. Help us to be faithful. Help us to trust you, Lord, and may you work a wonderful work in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.